Your life.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. This is day 3 of our conference, and today we have the summit. So the summit, we've got a great topic today. It's global well-being during the pandemic, and this is also something that I've been looking forward to the whole conference, and that is an opportunity to honor the late Dr. Ed Diener, who sadly passed away just a few weeks ago. So this summit, the way this is going to work is we are going to begin with a presentation from Dr. Paul Wong. After the presentation, we will follow with 4 speakers. We have, and in order, we have today Dr. Todd Kashdan, Dr. Tim Lomas, Dr. Bob Evans, and Dr. Matthew Lee. Each of them will present for approximately 10 minutes. So without further ado, let's begin again with a presentation by organizer Dr. Paul Wong.
I'm Paul Wong, and I'd like to welcome you all to this Summit on Global Wellbeing. And today, our main focus is to remember at dinner and also look forward to future research on global well-being. And we have a very distinguished panel today. I'm very pleased that Robert Emmons was able to be with us today because he was one of the original members working with at dinner to develop the very influential and impactful satisfaction with life scale. You know, personally, I always remember at dinner as a visionary researcher. Way back in 2001, when I attended the first Global Wellbeing Summit at the Gallup Center in Washington, I have several good talks with Ed Diener. At that time, he was the only psychologist keenly interested in cross-cultural research, as well as in contextual factors such as suffering. And he was very proud about his son's research in this area. You know, I say that his research is very important because it doesn't matter what kind of well-being you study, you just cannot get away with Ed Diener's 2-factor theory of subjective well-being. Now, the fact that all kinds of well-being are correlated with subjective well-being, it doesn't mean that they do not have their own unique characteristics. The other area I want to mention is that although people link hedonic well-being with subjective well-being, all 3 kinds of happiness are all related to subjective well-being. And as Diener mentioned, there are cultural and environmental differences and contextual differences. Each culture may arbitrate which kind of happiness is most popular. For example, in Asia, in China, in old China at least, the people are more value the mature kind of happiness, which I will explain further. Also, in terms of suffering, count-based mature happiness is also most relevant and important. I just completed a paper on existential suffering and palliative care. For palliative care patients, the best we can achieve is kind of mature happiness, even though they don't feel excited about things. Now, here is an example about why it's called mature happiness. This is a dialectical model, okay? You can see that it's not just a cognitive and affective models, factors in subjective well-being. Here, all four dimensions of human being or personhood are involved. The social culture, the psychological, the physical, and then up there is spiritual. Furthermore, in time of suffering or difficult situations, you need moral courage, you need a sense of meaning and purpose, and you need practical wisdom to get through. Now, these three kind of virtues are involved to help us to navigate between yin and yang. Now, yin and yang, or negative or positive, are not two poles of the same dimension, but rather two independent dimensions, where in the two-dimensional space, these three elements will decide which spot within the two-dimensional space is most suitable for a particular situation. Does it serve the purpose? Is it the right thing to do? Is the right thing to do? Similarly, your wisdom and purpose and courage also navigate a dynamic balance between self and other dimensions. So that's why mature happiness is the sweet spot, which balance, give up and balance, the optimal balance in any situation. Here is another example about balance. According to existential psychology, we need to navigate a dynamic balance between positive and negative conditions. One way to describe that situation, according to Nietzsche, the happiness and unhappiness, good and evil, they're all twins. They grew up together. Each will tend to ignore the dark side and favor the bright side. Mature happiness involving a balance between yin and yang. So these are some ideas that involve in mature happiness, which is just beginning to attract some attention. And now I open this to the panel for them to express, to share with us their insight and research. Thank you very much.
So we'll start with Todd. Go ahead, Todd.
Thank you. Obviously, people know that one of my main collaborators is Ed's son, Robert, and there's really no way in 10 minutes to provide some kind of semblance of the accomplishments that Ed gave. I think it's easy to say, and it's completely truthful to say, that he is the greatest happiness researcher in the field of social sciences, not just psychology. And due to the sheer quantity and the sheer quality and the seminal nature of his work, you're not going to find another Ed Diener. And I was thinking of how to use these 10 minutes to give an homage to the influence he's had on me and thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And I thought I'd focus on one single data point from his work, hundreds of articles. So I'm talking about one single article in 2011 that has 6 tables, dozens of rows of data, a single row in one of these tables. It's not mentioned in the abstract, it's not mentioned in the title, but it's had a profound influence on me and can generate an entire line of research. And before I give you this finding, I want to kind of give a backstory to what led to this finding. Ed wasn't happy with conducting research on 500 college students at a university. He wasn't happy with studying 1,000 people on MTurk. He wasn't happy with studying 1,000 people from one country. This data set for this one data point comes from the World Gallup poll. He was their senior scientist. 155 countries, over 65,000 individuals, studied from 2001 to 2010 to represent 95% of the world's freaking population for one data point. And what he asked was simple. Across the globe of humanity, like what brings us together in terms of our psychology as opposed to distinguishes us? And in other work, he focuses a lot on cross-cultural differences. And he asks, what is the single best predictor that you experience positive emotions today? And up there in the top two was the answer to the question, did you learn something yesterday, yes or no? Talking about Saudi Arabia, Croatia, New Zealand, Norway, Canada, Israel. If you answered yes, that yesterday you learned something new, you were more likely to experience frequent and intense positive emotions today. Now, I want to unpack this finding because it seems so intuitive once you know the answer. Think about the last few things that you learned over the past few weeks. Here's a few of mine. I learned how to put spin on my serve as I've learned pickleball the past 6 weeks. I basically learned that when I write blog posts, talking to journalist friends of mine, that you should figure out how to create continuity with an ongoing story that has virality in the news, which is not something I prefer to do, but it has value. Learned how to do that. Basically learned how to make a chicken français. None of these things led to positive sense of euphoria the day of or the day after. But I don't know my psychology backwards and forwards. I'm not paying attention to moment by moment. Over the course of time, you find that being a white belt, while it leads to emotions often such as confusion, a sense of doubt, a sense of insecurity, an increase in knowledge, this is not inherently the thing you think of when you think of, I want to enhance my positive emotions. But if you pull back from this finding and you connect it to the larger literature, you realize the power of this one data point, of like what brings humanity together. So I think of a couple of years ago, we lost another great scientific warrior, Jack Panksepp, and he talks about 8 different biological, evolutionarily derived emotion systems that are not just across humans, not just across other mammalian species, but also cetaceans, pigeons, hedgehogs. And one of these systems that I fell in love with, that he's been talking about since the 70s, is called the seeking system. And he has it in all capital letters, the seeking system. This is an evolutionary system to help human beings survive and navigate the difficulties of everyday life by constantly growing and expanding their sense of self so they can deal with adversity. Fits with what Paul just talked about the twin sides of our psychology, the light side and the dark side. Of particular relevance, Jack talks about the seeking system when we are exposed to novelty where we can potentially learn something. It spontaneously activates a sense of curiosity and exploration. And when this system is activated physiologically or chemically, it pushes us to move into this offset of trying to be curious and explore, as opposed to focus on our stability, our sense of coherence, our sense of what we know and who we are. If you add to this work by Ed and Jack, which I've liked to build on the shoulders of these characters, you can go a little bit further into, there's 2 different ways of thinking about curiosity. So one, which gets the most attention in the literature in positive psychology and well-being books and manuals and articles, is what I'd call bottom-up curiosity. So I'm at the Outer Banks right now. I got here last night at about 8:45 p.m., which means that I was there 15 minutes before the last sandwich shop closed in the Outer Banks. Pop in there, we've got minutes to make a decision. And on this sandwich board are a whole bunch of sandwich names that are strange for someone that did not grow up in the 80s and 90s. You have the Jeff Spicoli sandwich. You've got the Tony Montana sandwich. You've got the Zach Morris sandwich, the Kelly Spikowski sandwich. Now, if you don't recognize any of those names, you probably don't watch too much TV and movies. You're talking about Scarface. You're talking about that horrible 80s TV show, Saved by the Bell. You're talking about Fast Times Ridgemont High. I don't need to be curious. Just the fact that these names are the names for these sandwiches, and I'm wondering, well, why does Tony Montana's sandwich have bacon and then Jeff Spicoli's sandwich doesn't? And I'm talking to the stranger behind the counter. It's just my seeking system is activated to learn something new of how they're thinking differently about this. This is how we tend to think about curiosity. But if you really want to get to intentionality about increasing and sustaining happiness, you have to start being more intentional with top-down curiosity. So today, this morning at Outer Banks at the beach, when I go looking for shells with my youngest daughter, Violet, who's 9, I can think to myself, this is one of thousands of times I've searched for shells with my children over the course of my lifetime. Or with this laser-focused intention, I could say, what's different in terms of my daughter's demeanor, in terms of my demeanor, in terms of the ocean of what it's washing up, in terms of where the holes, the pecks are on all the shells from the birds and what types of birds are here in the Outer Banks. I'm bringing intentionality to make this experience, which is seemingly familiar, novel, and various in terms of the psychological experiences happening there. And this, I think, is the place when we think about sustaining happiness. So inspired by the work by Ed and by Jack Panksepp, you get to modern work by Sonia Lyubomirsky and Ken Sheldon, who are really the direct descendants of the next echelon of happiness researchers. And this fits perfectly into their underappreciated hedonic adaptation prevention model. And they ask this question, because it's all about asking great questions. And Ed was the master of this. The question was, okay, it is very easy to create increased positive changes in our well-being, but how can we boost or sustain those positive changes, knowing that we adapt so quickly to positive events in terms of they lose their influence on our emotions and our thoughts? This is a problem. It's a problem in our psychology. It makes sense evolutionary-wise because we're constantly on the search for new things. It's bad for the modern world where we want to sustain these positive feelings and thoughts, especially when we're with loved ones, with friends, having experiences that we don't want to end prematurely. Well, what Sonia and Ken found is that if you want to ramp up positive interventions, so Bob Emmons' gratitude intervention, which he seminally really introduced to the world, thankfully, what they found was that if you want to really not just enhance happiness, but sustain it, you have to alter the amount of variety in the types of people that you're grateful towards, the events that you're grateful towards, and maybe even take a step back and think about, are there things in my life that are so stable that I don't appreciate and express my gratitudes for? I've never actually had a root canal. I've got pretty good teeth. While I'm going bald, I'm not completely bald, so I can go out in the sun and have a little bit of sun protection. These are not things I'm regularly grateful for. I have a laundry machine and a dryer in my house. These are things I'm not normally grateful for. If we can expand the range through novelty and variety, we can broaden and intensify the benefits of gratitude. And the same thing for kindness. Ken and Sonia found that as well. If you do kind acts every day, you'll get a boost in your well-being. The effect size are small. But if you add intention, and if you go out tomorrow and say, tomorrow I'm going to do kind acts to people that don't look like me. And if you're a religious person, and next week you say, I'm going to try to engage in kindness towards people that have the opposite prevailing value system as me, atheists, agnostics. Maybe the week after that, you say, I'm going to try to focus on being kind towards older adults or young children. Well, now you've just brought novelty in, and what they continue to find is this is a moderator. that intensifies the benefits of positive experiences. So my time is short. I want to kind of bring this home and just say is that thanks to Ed, we have learned what happiness is with precision, how to measure it, what are some of the elements that lead to the prediction that we're going to have the highest levels of different components of well-being, positive emotions on a given day, life satisfaction on a given day. And we've learned from this of particular psychologically sound mechanisms that are conceptually tied to work, such as Jack Panksepp, where we can figure out that we can't just increase happiness, but we can actually figure out to make it a sustainable element of our lives. We've got a lot to be grateful towards, and it's really I'm really honored by the fact that you can be able to talk about my appreciation and my love for Ed Diener and what he's contributed.
Great.
So thanks for giving me so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we'll have Tim Lomas.
Thanks, Daniel. Can I share my screen? Can I share a PowerPoint?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Todd, for that great start. I'm just going to try and, so I've got around 8 minutes, so I'm going to try and monitor the time here. So for my segment, I'd love to pay homage to Ed by introducing a project with which I've had the great privilege and gratitude to be involved with over the last few years, which is very relevant here because it fits perfectly with the theme of global well-being. But more importantly, Ed was the scientific advisor for this project and really thoroughly influential in terms of creating and how the project developed. So it's really a testament, I think, to his great, wisdom and development throughout his long career, that he was continuing to probe the boundaries of knowledge and understanding, always ahead of the curve. It's just amazing because, we think about positive psychology starting in the late 90s, but he was creating the satisfaction with life scale with Professor Emmons here, back in the 80s. In my keynote presentation just now, I spoke about potentially the cutting edge of the field at present, if we want to call that the third wave, potentially, being around being more globally inclusive, exploring global and cross-cultural perspectives on well-being. But as Todd just pointed out in his segment, Ed was way ahead of the curve, conducting global research back in the early 2000s and even before, into the 90s. So I think Ed was such an obvious choice for this project to try to bring on board as its key advisor. And in that context, I had the privilege only of meeting him twice on a Zoom call, but it was a really beautiful and precious moment for me. And I know others in the foundation actually had the pleasure of visiting him at home, and that was very meaningful to them. So I think the whole project really is testament to Ed. And so I'm just going to share very briefly, because I only have a few minutes, some of the work we've been doing, which I think, again, is just one element of his great legacy. So this project is a partnership between Gallup and a Japanese foundation called Wellbeing for Planet Earth. As Todd mentioned, Ed has been a kind of scientific advisor for Gallup going back decades. So it was a really natural and kind of easy partnership in a sense. So the aim of the global, going to the slide. So really, if you were attending my keynote just now, the aim here is to really take a global perspective on well-being, and I'll go into a bit more detail about what I mean by that. But really, the essence, I would say, is to try and incorporate non-Western perspectives into the Gallup World Poll, because Gallup itself has already been a forerunner in global and cross-cultural research on well-being, having started its Global Wellbeing Survey in 2005, surveying over 150 countries, covering over 99% of the world's adult population. So it's an incredible database, an incredible resource, and a great effort. And in the context of the Gallup World Poll, they've been gathering data on happiness and well-being since 2005, principally using measures of positive and negative emotions and then life evaluation in the form of Hadley Cantrill's ladder item, which asks people to imagine a ladder from 0 to 10, representing their worst and best possible life imaginable, and then also to imagine that ladder 5 years into the future. So I want to be careful in how I phrase this, because on the one hand, you could make the case that these constructs are somewhat Western-centric, like psychology more broadly, in as much as they've been developed in Western contexts, particularly the United States. And you could say they're informed by the kind of culture and values and norms and traditions in that context. So to give one example, measures of positive emotion tend to prioritize or emphasize high arousal forms of emotion, such as enjoyment. And then people have made the case that other cultures, say in the Eastern region, perhaps have a greater emphasis on lower arousal forms of positive emotion, such as peace and calmness and tranquility. But then, having said that, I don't want to get into this crude distinction where high arousal emotions are Western and low arousal emotions are Eastern, let's say, because the existing measures in the World Poll, they are meaningful and relevant globally. People understand the question, they can answer it, it makes sense globally. So it's not that the metrics are inaccurate, but the question is whether they represent everything we're interested in finding out about. So to that extent, the essence of this project was to engage with what we might call non-Western perspectives on well-being, to see if there's any ideas and constructs that may also be relevant. And in so doing, just as you can make the case that life valuation and positive emotions, they are relevant globally, even if a construct might have been emphasized in a non-Western culture, it doesn't mean it's also not relevant in the West. So as I'll come on to, one of our items is around balance and harmony, which you could make the case that this has been emphasized more in the East than in the West, although the West does have traditions of emphasizing these concepts. You know, going back, for example, to Aristotle with his notion of the golden mean in relation to character virtue, and obviously more recently notions like work-life balance. So we have notions of balance and harmony in Western cultures, but you could say they've been emphasized to a greater degree in the East and hence have been somewhat missing from psychology. But as I say, they are relevant globally. There's a really interesting study by Antonella Della Fave and colleagues back in 2016, looking at lay perceptions of happiness globally, and the most prominent psychological definition was a sense of inner harmony. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly fast forward. So the essence is trying to bring in non-Western perspectives on well-being. So we conducted an initial summit in Kyoto, which was beautiful. I'd always wanted to go to Japan. This is my first time there, and I absolutely loved it. Ed wasn't able to visit us there in person, but he joined via video link, and his input and advice was invaluable. And through this process, we identified various topics that we wanted to bring into the Gallup World Poll. 3, you might say, are emphasized in Eastern cultures, particularly balance and harmony, peace and calm, and communal well-being, as well as some other constructs that aren't Eastern per se, but you could say are still missing from the Gallup World Poll, mainly ones relating to eudaimonia. So this is obviously a more detailed presentation than I can share here, but we put a lot of thought into balance and harmony, peace and calm, and communal well-being. And then in 2020, we embedded these questions relating to these into the Gallup World Poll. So we had 3 questions relating to low arousal positive emotions. Did you experience calmness during a lot of the day yesterday? Do you feel at peace with your life or not? Would you rather live an exciting life or a calm life? I'm not going to share results from the World Poll here, but I will just say with this question, I invite you to think how you'd answer it. But just to give the game away, with the exception of 2 countries, every country preferred a calm life. And in case you're wondering, the exceptions were Vietnam and Georgia, which is interesting. So we're keen to see why those 2 in particular. But we had 3 on low arousal positive emotions, 1 on balance and harmony. Do you feel the various aspects of your life are in balance or not? 1 on relationship to the group. Do you think people should focus more on taking care of themselves or on others? And then some others. So just a real brief snapshot of our research. I would invite you to, I thought I had the website there, check out our website, the Global Wellbeing Initiative. And like I say, I think the whole project really is testament to Ed and his influence and wisdom. I would hope shines through the project and the work we're trying to do. And like I say, hopefully this is just one small part of his ongoing legacy. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. Now we'll have Dr. Bob Emmons.
Thank you, Dan. And Paul, thank you for arranging this symposium. This is just awesome. Ed Diener, as you know, and a lot of you know, was my mentor. I entered graduate school 40 years ago this month, August of 1981. Wow, that makes me old. And to study with Ed, I had no interest in the topic of happiness or subjective well-being. I was just writing to professors at different graduate programs that I thought I'd be interested in working with or going to. And he responded with a tremendously warm invitation, a 3-page single-spaced letter he wrote to me while he was on sabbatical. And I knew that was the place for me at that time. So I'm so grateful to him and to you guys for arranging this and being on this symposium here today. I thought for a minute there I was on mute, but I guess not, so all good. So my first job out of graduate school, now I'll go back and talk about Ed, was at Michigan State University. And the department hosted a conference every few years known as the Henry A. Murray Lectures. And the Henry A. Murray Lectures, so Henry Murray was a personality psychologist, and my field of training was personality psychology. So naturally, I wanted to be on this committee that would select the speakers, that would nominate speakers to come. And it was kind of a big deal, this conference. We had 300 to 400 people came to this every few years. And we had some, in the early years before I got there, some really high-profile speakers. But then it got harder and harder to find high-profile speakers. You know, it's kind of like Dancing with the Stars. You know, the first few episodes, first few years, you have the big stars, and then you have people you never heard of after that. So anyway, the chair of the committee that I worked with, he had one basic criteria for deciding who should be invited. Okay, one litmus test, and he said, "Is the person an originator or a summarizer?" Okay, he thought there were 2 types of academics. There was originators, right? Those who are creative, innovative, original, right? And then there are those who are summarizers, who they kind of like summarize and rehash what's already been said. So that was the basic thing. So every time we came up with a name, I suggest someone else in the committee would suggest someone. So, well, sit back and say, well, is this person an originator, or if you were a summarizer, you know, you're off the list, right? And so, you know, it's much better academically to be on the hierarchy, more prestigious, obviously, to be an originator than a summarizer. Well, clearly, no doubt, Ed, like Paul, are originators and was an originator. There was no field of subjective well-being, as you guys have already said, as Tim said and as Todd said, without Ed, or happiness studies, of course, and likely there wouldn't have been unless he had come along. I really think that was the case. And one thing you may not know is that he really took a big chance at doing this, at studying what he did, particularly because of where he was at the University of Illinois, known as kind of like ground zero for empirical psychology, right? Very rigorous, very measurement, very quantitative. You know, the risk with being seen as kind of flaky, you know, flaky at worst, maybe irrelevant at best in terms of mainstream psychology, but he certainly didn't let that deter him. Illinois could also be a very brutal place, you know, if you didn't kind of follow the standard procedures and paradigms and methodologies and so forth to get tenure, to get acceptance and approval, the sorts of things we all want, you know, we all crave as academics. But, you know, he knew that he was onto something very, very important. And obviously he was extremely successful because in a couple of different surveys, I noticed, I was looking at this before early this morning, there was a 2018 survey of the 50 most influential living psychologists in the world, so just 3 years ago, and Ed was number 15, 15 out of 50. That's pretty good, right? And then another study was published, I think it was around the same time, the top 100 most eminent psychologists of the modern era, and he was number 10. And that was in terms of like citation metrics, textbook coverage, the usual sorts of ways of measuring eminence. So clearly, huge impact on the field. And I think all of that was because there was one thing that Ed knew well. And he demonstrated that when he was teaching and when he gave talks at conferences. And that was that psychology is about people. And he knew that. That was the starting point, right, Paul? Psychology is about people. And he actually often began his lectures in undergraduate classes. So I was his TA in psychology of personality. I basically learned how to teach because I was his TA. And so the way this system was set up, there was 3 sections of this course, very popular at Illinois, big classes. And so you teach 3 times a day, 3 times a week. So it was pretty demanding. But anyway, so I'd sit and listen to him speak. And then I got to teach the next year. And I'll never forget, one student came up to me afterward and he said, you know, you did a really good job, but you sounded too much like him. Like, you should develop your own, you know, your own style, your own persona. And I knew what he meant. I mean, it was, you know, well-intended comment, but I actually thought that's a good thing, right? That I was, you know, trying to be like my mentor in many respects. But anyway, he would often start the class by asking students to volunteer what they believed was the most important thing in life. The question was something like that, like, what do you desire most? Or what do you think is the most important thing in life, right? Like a big question like that, right? And then, you know, they would come up with all sorts of different things. You know, they would say, well, friends, family, health, education, freedom. You know, there was one student, by the way, who said revenge was the most important thing in life, right? And that was kind of a unique answer. And I often reminded Ed that, wasn't that the student that failed your class? So you better watch your back, you know? So it's kind of funny. But anyway, there was another one who said, like, drinking beer was the number one most important thing in life. And he was wearing a t-shirt that day, that student, who's the front of the t-shirt said, everyone must believe in something. And the back of the t-shirt said, I believe I will have another beer. So obviously that was his ultimate concern, you know. Anyway, but Ed would argue convincingly and compellingly, I think, that people desired what they did because ultimately they believed this would make them happy. Right. Happiness was the ultimate goal. Happiness, you know, in the long term, enduring happiness or sustainable happiness. And he dedicated his life to understanding, you know, the mysteries and unlocking the meanings of happiness and giving people the tools they needed to acquire more happiness and to lead better lives. And that's the legacy that he left. Anyway, that's just a few reflections on Ed. Back in the day, of course, he didn't want to use the word happiness just because it had all sorts of weak or flaky connotations. So subjective well-being sounds much more impressive, doesn't it? And I often give talks on gratitude now by talking about the link between gratitude and happiness. And I say, we didn't use the H word back then. You know, it's kind of like studying religion or spirituality. You just avoided that. It'd be the anti-tenure factor. Well, he had tenure, so he didn't care. I think he would have studied happiness even if he didn't have tenure because he believed it was that important and that meaningful and what gave life meaning and purpose and value for people, and surely did with him and his life as well. So I just have one. I just want to show you a picture. Let's see if I get this to work. That's me and Ed back in 2006. For some reason, I have very few pictures of he and I wish I had taken more. And this should be a lesson to you as well. Always take off your name tag when you're at a meeting before a picture is taken because it just looks so dorky. But anyway, a couple of weeks ago, it would have been his 75th birthday. And I made a Facebook post, a little honor to Ed, just talking about my relationship with him. So if you're interested in learning more about me and him and he and I, you can go to Facebook and look that up. And I made it open to everyone. I changed the privacy settings. So if we're not friends or if you have no friends, you can still access that. And Ed also knew about family. He had a huge family. He was very proud of. And he would send out the annual Christmas card or end of the year report card on everyone. And it was never about him and what he was doing. It was always about his family, his kids, his grandkids. So proud of them and everything that they did and stood for. And that reminds me, you guys were talking about balance before and so forth. And he knew that, you know, you could be an academic and be successful and be eminent and thought of as, you know, the leader in your field, which he was, but still have a successful family life. They're not incompatible. Sometimes we think they are, but he proved that you could do both and be highly successful at both of those. So that's my story. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Paul and Dan and Todd and Tim and Aaron, everybody on the panel. I'll turn it back over to Dan at this point. Thank you,
Great.
Paul.
Thank you, Bob. I hope my mute was on. I was laughing through a lot of your presentation there. So now we'll take it over. We'll hand it over to Matthew. Dr. Lee. Go ahead, Dr. Lee.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Paul, and everyone on the panel. Really delighted to be celebrating the life and work of Ed Diener. I'll have a few remarks in my 10 minutes on the flavorful life, which is bitter and sweet, pathways to flourishing in a time of suffering. And first things first, paying respect to Ed and his collaborators. And it's important that he led this work, but he collaborated with people so effectively. And a few takeaways that have helped me in thinking about my own work. One is that the structural factors that are often posited to account for variations in flourishing across groups, such as material wealth, are frequently moderated by cultural factors. And so I've cited just a few of Ed's co-authored articles that help make some of the points that I'll talk about today. But we can prepare to be surprised that one variable which we see as very important is perhaps not telling the whole story. So just as a couple of examples, or just one example, I guess, in the interest of time, one of Ed's co-authored studies of people living in difficult circumstances in Calcutta, India, in slum housing and brothels or on the streets, found that their life satisfaction was higher than one might expect. And this outcome was related to, quote, a strong emphasis on social relationships and satisfaction derived from them. And we have taken this to heart at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and some of our work in progress is now focused on the importance of social relationships above and beyond material conditions. More generally, if an individual's psychosocial orientation fits well with the values promoted by the dominant culture in that individual society, they're more likely to experience a higher degree of flourishing. So, for example, religious people might experience a higher level of happiness more generally, but this is especially the case in religious nations rather than in non-religious nations. To relate this to the culture of Calcutta, outside observers who expect low well-being due to extreme poverty may overlook important positive cultural aspects, a high sense of moral goodness, religiosity, social connectedness, and family ties. The individual who values these aspects of the culture is likely to flourish to a much greater degree than one who exalts materialistic ideals. So this is the importance of the macro setting for the individual's psychological experience. And finally, people are resilient and able to flourish in difficult environments. Ed and his collaborators helped us to understand why, and we're building on this in our work. So it's appropriate for us to take a moment of gratitude, if in these 10 minutes we have time for just a moment of gratitude. So I'll invite us to do that. Okay, thank you. So what is flourishing? Well, I happen to really like the perspective in this book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing by Francis Su, which frames flourishing in terms of wholeness. And, we can think about flourishing as wholeness amidst adversity, as Francis Su does. Again, wonderfully in this book about math. Of all topics. We can also think about it in terms of the flavorful life, which is one of the participants in our community of practice at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard from Japan suggests. And so she shared this image of preparing a meal for this tea ceremony. And you start off by taking a taste of something bitter. And then when you take a taste of something sweet, it's even sweeter. And this is the flavorful life, which doesn't push away the bitter in life, but integrates it into the sweet. So for Francis Su, these are all quotes from this book. Human flourishing is wholeness of being and doing, of realizing one's potential and helping others do the same, of acting with honor and treating others with dignity, of living with integrity, even in challenging circumstances. And we see this on display in the work I just cited by Ed and his collaborators. Flourishing comes through the exercise of virtue And virtue is excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. And sometimes in conversations about happiness and related topics, well-being, flourishing, complete well-being, this element seems to be muted a little bit. So we'd like to draw more attention to this. Francis Su claims that the proper practice of mathematics cultivates virtues that help people flourish. And he ends his book on math with a chapter on love. So again, I think if math has this aim, why not all human endeavors? And he tells a really wonderful story about almost dropping out of Harvard's doctoral program in math. And if not for the grace of one professor, he probably would have. And so this orientation that math is about flourishing and flourishing is promoted by love, and that love is part of the practice of math, I think is right on the mark. Love is the key ingredient in the flourishing, flavorful life. And love is an invitation to suffer because we've become vulnerable and open to heartbreak. But that's part of this flavorful dish that combines the bitter and the sweet. So there's plenty of research. My background in graduate school partly was at the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. And we studied the aftermath of earthquakes and floods and various kinds of terrible events, lots of suffering, lots of people losing their lives. And what was interesting is that survivors talked about how meaningful stressors may enrich our soil by enabling warm connections and valued contributions. So natural disasters for survivors seem to release them from what Rebecca Solnit in her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, refers to as the social disaster of daily life: meaningless stressors, alienation, loss of identity, undignified work. So for a moment in the struggle to help each other survive and find clean water and food to eat and shelter in a harsh environment, people are released into a deeply compassionate and meaningful paradise of unbroken solidarities. The Japanese word for this, kizuna, I think captures it: strong social connections that emerge from addressing suffering together. And Greg Frachon's wonderful book, Compassion and Healing in Medicine and Society, would say this is an attachment solution to life's ever-present separation challenges. We're being separated from loved ones, we're being separated from jobs that we value or other things that we value in life, and we can find creative attachment solutions, as illustrated with these neighbors pushing this neighbor's car out of the flood here. The problem is that we experience a lot of meaningless stress. So it's appropriate for this conference that we think about this image, which I saw at the Met Museum in New York, you know, a person alone with a non-restorative addiction. And in case you don't understand what's going on here, there's a little placard next to the painting that says, "This is an anxious smoker lying awake while the clock ticks away the small hours." So we sort of in danger of experiencing this if we don't come together in solidarity. And so there's a whole industry now to try to bring people together through the experience of shared suffering. These racers are running through an obstacle course where there are wires hanging down they have to run through that shock them with like 10,000 volts of electricity. And so it's excruciating. But through the course of this obstacle course, they are connecting with each other, helping each other, building a sense of care and compassion and solidarity. I'm going to actually skip this in the last minute that I have and focus on an image, and it's the smiling image of Akbar Cook, principal at a high school in Newark, New Jersey. And I want to just suggest that the flavorful life involves the joy of loving others into being. This is Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers' famous phrase, through reappraisal and transcending difficult circumstances. So you think that things are somewhat hopeless, but there's always a path forward. So Akbar Cook noticed his students were being killed through violent crime, and he said, you know what? I'm not going through the summer being a bystander. I'm going to do something about it. I'm a kid that grew up in the Boys and Girls Club, so let's open the doors when all the crime was happening of the school that he was principal at, and let's provide a safe place. They needed us, so we just loved on them and provided all these resources. We had to go at them a different way, and we've led with love. being consistent. We just loved on them until they realized we weren't going anywhere. Kids weren't coming to school, he realized. Some students weren't showing up because they were wearing dirty clothes and getting bullied for their dirty clothes. Well, that's outside my job description as principal. No, that's a bystander orientation. We can reappraise that and say, you know, what can we do? So he marshaled community resources, and today the high school has 5 commercial grade washing machines and dryers. So this connection with others, we're stronger together and we can love each other into being, I think is exactly what Ed and colleagues found in Calcutta. And it teaches us something very important about the flourishing life, which is the flavorful life, combining bitter and sweet. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was such a great summary of all this research. Now we will hand it over to our discussant, Jarden, Dr. Aaron Jarden. Thank you. Go ahead, Aaron.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and welcome everyone. This is what it'd look like if I managed to get the video working today, but not the case. Those were some great talks, and it's going to be really hard to synthesize those in 5 minutes, but there are probably 3 things that I want to pick up on. The first is, and I think it was mentioned by most speakers, is the fact that Ed was just an absolutely fantastic mentor, a mentor to so many people. And I think his work really does live on in the work that's coming out of the people that he worked with. I think he was very, very astute at choosing who he worked with. And I look at the young people that he's mentored, especially lately, and look at the research they're putting out and the impact that they're having on the world and the products they're developing. And I think it's no mistake that you know, he strategically chose people that had absolutely fantastic ideas. So that's the first thing that I want to mention is I think he played an absolutely fantastic mentoring role in building the capacity of happiness and well-being research beyond his work itself. Probably the second thing I'd pick up is Ed really moved through different worlds, is what I observe. We kind of think of him, or a lot of people think of him as a happiness scientist or a positive psychology researcher, or they put him in a particular camp, but I think he was so much bigger and broader than that. When I saw him having the most fun, and you know, it was he worked with a lot of economists, a lot of policy people. You know, he loved talking to sociologists. You know, Todd mentioned at the start that, you know, he's not just a psychologist, he's one of the best social scientists, and I think that's absolutely dead right. But I think it's even bigger than that, because what he tried to do was something that's really hard for all of us, is actually to make our research useful. So you know, he'd happily meet with policy people at various levels of government, and, you know, to make this research real and have an impact. So he thought about his work and the impact his work could have beyond just publishing books and papers, obviously, which he was, you know, renowned and astound. You know, the volume of work, his complete works, is just amazing legacy to build from. But actually conceptually thinking about how the work that he did was gonna be useful, I think was one of his main accomplishments. So that's probably the second thing that I just want to pick up on too, is how he moved through different fields with different types of people to contextualize the research that he was doing and building with other people. I think was just fantastic. Another thing that many people have picked up on was the global nature of and the big scale impact of his research, looking at cross-cultural findings and things like that. And again, that's really pushing in some really novel directions. And as I kind of see it at the moment, I think Ed paved the way to help us understand a lot of the correlates to happiness and well-being, and to start to map out what happiness is. I mean, Todd said at the start, he really helped us understand what happiness is and how to measure it. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we know what's related to this thing called happiness, but I think the fact that very few people in our field define happiness or define well-being or its associated terms, flourishing, wholeness, and so forth, I really don't think we have a good understanding of what these things are. But through Ed's research, we have a good understanding of what's related to this thing that we're trying to understand. And I think that's really evident in the fact that people don't define define their terms in what they publish. So I think building on the back of a lot of Ed's research, we have a good base. It's almost like we've cleared the section to lay some foundations, and we've got some good building blocks and tools there to start this. But I see his legacy is really we are at the start. It's not like we've undiscovered a whole lot that we can then sit back and move on from. We've got this really rich base, which he led a lot of this this work to actually, from a scientific perspective, move the science forward with clear description. Because if anything, one thing that stands out about Ed Diener was he was the most solid researcher there is. None of his research was ever questioned. It was always methodical. It was always on point, and it was always a pleasure to read. So with that, I'll pass back to you, Daniel.
Great. Well, thank you, Aaron. Thanks for thinking on your toes there, giving us at least a screen capture of you in front of your computer, great summary. It is 11:25. I'm just thinking of the time here. Do any closing thoughts from anyone before just like a quick thought here before we wrap up?
Thank you for taking part. It's a great panel. Looking forward to seeing you again at my keynote right after.
Yeah, Paul's keynote starts in 5 minutes. So, well, let's end it there. We could go on. We could probably talk for several hours or more about the legacy of Dr. Ed Diener. But we'll leave it at that for now. Thank you all.
Stardust and my soul can reach beyond the stars. The deeper the valley, the higher the mountain. No distance is too far when you're holding on to hope. Sing me a sad song over and over. I'll be alright by and by. Let me be consumed in a love divine to find where the treasure lies. I want to hear that small voice whisper to my forgotten soul. They say it's never too late to start again. What breaks your heart will make